I'm Catherine McGrady, the CEO of CNA, and this is CNA Talks. In this podcast, our experts discuss current events, policies, and research that impact our nation's security.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for CNA Talks, episode 105, a conversation today about how to develop and use autonomous systems ethically. My name's Don Boroughs. I'm a senior advisor in the communications office at CNA, and I'm privileged today to have a very special guest from the U.S. Office of Naval Research, Dr. Jason Stack, who has been the director of autonomy there and has also been the chair of the Intelligent Autonomous Systems Strategy Development Team. So he's the perfect person for this discussion. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, thanks so much, Don. Really appreciate all the work you and the CNA team have done on this study, and also really appreciate you having me here. Looking forward to having the conversation.
Glad to have you, and also very glad to have CNA Principal Research Scientist, Dr. Mike Stumborg, from our Strike and Air Warfare program. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thank you, Don. Looking forward to the discussion.
So Mike is the author of a recent CNA report with a title so long, I'm going to let you say it, Mike.
Thank you, Don. It's the Dimensions of Autonomous Decision-Making. Subtitle is A First Step in Transforming the Policies and Ethics Principles Regarding Autonomous Systems into Practical System Engineering Requirements.
And because that's a mouthful, I've taken to calling it a checklist for ethical autonomy. You're okay with that?
We're fine with that.
We'll learn a lot more about that report coming up. But I think, Jason, I would like to first get a sense of how you think about ethical autonomy broadly.
Thanks, Don. That's actually one of the most important questions that we can be talking about right now. So when we think about ethics and autonomy and AI, we want to look at it from a couple of different aspects. So first of all, when you think about it from the perspective of armed conflict, so specifically using force in combat and incorporating weapon systems with autonomous functionality, at the highest level, we, the international community, we have come to an understanding of how to conduct combat, how to conduct warfare. Those conversations are fundamentally in the context of the international humanitarian law of armed conflict. And in the United States, that is instantiated as the law of war. Now, for those that don't know what that is, there's a couple of major pillars. They include understanding the military necessity of the use of force. They include being able to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. And it includes something called proportionality, which is ensuring that collateral damage is not excessive. Those are not all of the principles, but those are some of the keys. And those principles govern the use of force in combat, period. It doesn't actually matter how you implement the use of force. So now when we talk about weapon systems with autonomous functionality, the use of AI and autonomy, the law of war further says that the responsibility of complying with the law of war, that can only be performed by human beings. It may not ever be delegated to machines. So the takeaway here is that right here with the law of war, we have our North Star, our high-level guideposts, our understanding of what we need to be doing. And the conversation that we need to be having as the developer community supporting, the broader DoD, is to understand, okay, how do we go do that? And so we have further policies. In the DoD, we love to refer to our policies by numbers. So all of our DoD components know it is our 3000.09 affectionately, but it's actually our policy on autonomous weapon systems. So we have this policy. It's intended to make sure that we don't have unintended engagements. But fundamentally, what it does, this policy, it basically draws the line between what's autonomous and what's not autonomous. And then it says, hey, if you are going to go build an autonomous weapon system, we're going to do a review both when you start developing and also before fielding. And so that's the policy that we use to ensure that what we're doing is actually compliant with the law of war. So putting all that together, when we think about weapon systems with autonomous functionality, the fundamental goal is to ensure our humans, to ensure our military commanders can exercise appropriate levels of human judgment. That's the overarching goal, to ensure that we uphold these principles. Now, when we zoom out away from just combat use, when we think about when we're using autonomy or AI, regardless of the application, here we have the DoD AI Ethical Principles. If you're not familiar with these principles, you can search them online. There's a lot of good information written about them, but the one word or explanation of these is responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. These are the 5 DoD AI ethical principles. And said in plain language, the goal here is to really just ensure that as we field a state-of-the-art military, that we also maintain a leadership role in the responsible, ethical, and legal use of autonomous systems on and off the battlefield. And that then has implications for us, the developer community.
So obviously there are a lot of parts of the DoD that are interested in this topic. Can you explain for me what is the role of the Office of Naval Research and who else is involved in the issue?
Absolutely, yes. So from a DoD perspective, we have the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. They own our 3000.09 or our autonomous weapons system policy. They own all of our policies across the board. We have the Joint AI Center, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. They have lead for not only the AI ethical principles, but looking at how do we operationalize those? How do we make them actionable? Then, of course, you have the services. For us, Navy and Marine Corps, i.e. the Department of the Navy, we have the Unmanned Campaign, which is our strategy and our approach, and it has a foundational pillar of ethics and policy and law. And then we have the developer community. And when I say the developer community, I'm really talking broadly. This is government, it's industry, it's academia, and it's both our domestic community as well as our international community, because we are a combined community. So those are the folks that are involved. In the Office of Naval Research, as one of the leaders of the science and technology community, so as one of the leaders of the developer community, our goal is really to help the developer community participate as this broader team and work out really the implementation details, right? So we understand, we know our high-level guidance, we know what needs to be done, we have our AI ethical principles, we have these pillars of the law of war. The real question is, how do we implement the machines and the human machine team to enable those foundational principles that we already know? And that's where folks like CNA and the great work that you guys have done with this study really comes into play. It's pulling that thread, understanding what that implementation looks like.
So for that implementation, how important will it be to have tools or systems that systematically turn the principles into action?
So the tools are absolutely critical, and we're going to be developing a lot of tools over time. I think the critical question here is, to what end? What do we need tools to do? And I think really there are many, but there's 2 important things that we need our tools to do. One is we need to ensure that the humans can do the things that the humans must do intuitively and easily. And we already talked about what some of those things are, right? The example that I like here is I like looking at the automotive industry. If we think about, when the car was first invented, it was pretty bare bones, but we added a lot of things. We added tools to that human-machine interface. For example, one of the things that helped the operator ensure not only legal, but safe and responsible operation is the speedometer, right? We don't normally think about a speedometer in that way, but that was part of that development, right? And now we have more sophisticated things like warning lights to warn you that your passenger hasn't put on their seatbelt. We also have a lot of design tools for the engineers to get crumple zones in the right places to ensure safe and effective operation. So that's one of the things that we need to develop tools to do. The other one is we need tools to help us ensure that our designs allow machines to behave ethically. Now, I want to say that again, and we need to be clear on what that means and what it does. We need our designs to allow machines to behave ethically. What we are not saying there is that we are asking machines to go make open-ended determinations of what even constitutes ethical behavior in these dynamic and unstructured worlds. That's actually not what we're talking about. What we're trying to do here is make sure that the machines are capable and ensuring that they can behave ethically. The example I like here, sticking with the automotive example, is ABS, or anti-lock braking system. If you think about it for a second, ABS is a piece of automation that removes the control from the human and does exactly the opposite of what the human is asking the car to do. However, we as a community of users and developers and policymakers, we have figured out and we have put bounds around the temporal bounds, the scope, the authorities of when the machine can make that determination and what authorities the machine actually has. That's an example where we have basically taken the human control and turned it into guidance, and we let the machine implement in the most safe and effective way.
Very interesting analogy. And these tools are really the ultimate goal of your report, I believe, Mike. Is that right?
That's correct. When we started this study, Jason already mentioned the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy and the Joint AI Center's 5 ethics principles for AI. And we asked ourselves, what does an engineer do with those policy prescriptions? How do they ensure that what they're building conforms to the policy that they're required to obey? So our attempt here was to make a tool that allowed those engineers to develop something that was measurable and testable, that they could then turn the policy into ethically conforming gear.
And as you said, the subtitle of this report says it's a first step in transforming these policies and principles into practical requirements. If it is a first step, then help me understand what that endpoint might look like. How might a final system for implementing ethical principles in autonomy work?
Well, it's a first step in a system engineering process. One of the other policies that the Department of the Navy has is how they implement the defense acquisition system. And part of that is a system engineering master plan. There's a policy, Secretary of Navy Instruction 5000.2F. And in that policy, there is an appendix, an enclosure actually, that has 29 system engineering elements in it. Everything from environmental concerns, corrosion, electromagnetic spectrum usage, all of the other things you need to consider when you're building a system for the Department of Defense. We see our tool as enabling a 30th element of a system engineering master plan, where every program manager who's building something for the Department of the Navy or the Department of the Defense can now consider the ethical conformity of what they're building, and they use our tool to make sure that they can put a check in that 30th box in the system engineering master plan.
So should it be possible to use such a system to truly verify that a particular autonomous system can be used ethically for a particular operation?
Part of what we've done here is recognize the fact that the policies in place have a lot of subjective terminology in them, something that it's difficult for an engineer or a contracting officer who has to verify that a vendor has built and delivered something that's ethically conforming. How do you know that they've done that or not? So verifying whether something is ethical or can be used ethically is one thing. What we've done is put together a checklist that says, if you can put a check in all of these boxes, and each program manager can use the material in our report to tailor and build their own checklist. But if you can check all of these boxes, then you have built a system which is ethically conforming.
Yeah, Jason, the vision that I'm hearing from both you and from Mike seems a little bit different from what you might hear in debates about the use of autonomous systems in conflict. Are there some misconceptions in the current public debate about military use of AI that you think need to be cleared up?
So there are certainly plenty of myths and misconceptions. I'll just highlight 3 briefly. One is in particular to sort of the DoD community, and I can certainly confirm firsthand that this myth and misconception is still out there. There's a misconception that autonomy is just not allowed in weapons systems, which is exactly contrary to what our policy says on autonomous weapons system. That's within the DoD community. When you look more broadly, I think one of the biggest myths is variance around this notion that behaving ethically is somehow a hindrance or a detriment, or it restricts you in some way. This often manifests, in comments that I'll get almost every time I speak, which is, something along the lines of, hey, Jason, if we're restricting ourselves in this ethical way, but, others don't, then we're at some kind of disadvantage, right? And the answer is no, that's actually not true. It's a fallacy. And there's a couple of reasons that that's a fallacy, but one is behaving in a moral and just way is absolutely an enduring advantage. It really is. Human beings across societies and over time, we rally around moral and just behavior. We gravitate to supporting folks that behave in just and ethical ways. And if you look at examples where we've taken positions, for example, biological and chemical warfare, right? We've taken a position there. In the international community, we rally around that. We need to be those partners of choice. You can extend that to a very tactical rationale as well, which is it is a fallacy to claim that the way you counter unethical behavior is to also behave unethically. That's simply a fallacy. Again, think chemical or biological warfare, right? Think back to World War I. The way you counter mustard gas for certain is not by employing the same warfare technique. It's just a fallacy to think that you have to behave unethically to counter these unethical behaviors. It's just simply a myth. The last one that I'll mention just briefly, because this is also a really common myth, is this notion that the only way to implement ethical behavior is to have direct human control. This is often claimed as like some kind of human in the loop or human on the loop kind of control. This is a myth because it conflates and confuses principles with implementation. You talk about having a human in the loop. That's simply an implementation approach. It's one approach, one way you can implement. What you really want, again, is appropriate levels of human judgment. That's the principle. Control is an implementation choice. Go back to the ABS example, right? The principle there is, by analogy, is stop the car. That's the principle. The implementation choice is either slam on the brakes really hard or have a piece of automation that does something different, right? It modulates brakes. It does different things, but it basically achieves that principle in a more safe and effective way.
To sort of piggyback on what Jason said, one of the misconceptions I think I would like to see put to bed as a result of this report is what I've read from the community that's opposed to the military use of autonomy technology. And that is that they seem to be almost universally of a belief that we are not concerned with ethical behavior. In my experience, not just in this project, the US Department of Defense spends more time and energy and resources on ensuring legal and ethical behavior in its operations than any other organization I'm aware of. And it's not just for autonomous systems. So we need to convey to the public, because there's this misconception and this lack of trust in our ability to use this technology ethically.
Thanks. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sebastian Bay, a research analyst with CNA's gaming program. Our team designs games to address problems in a wide range of scenarios, from the battlefield to the classroom and everywhere in between. We design bespoke war games specific to your organization's needs, and we draw upon the diverse talent at CNA to bring you the best product possible. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please visit our website at cna.org/wargaming.
We're back. So, Mike, your checklist approach has at its core a list of about 565 questions, actually. Can you help me understand who needs to answer those questions?
When we first started this study, our approach was trying to identify how an operational commander could identify and assess risk of the use of autonomous systems. But it became very clear that there are multiple places in the process where you can assess risk. So we looked at not just what the operational commander has to ask themselves before they deploy a system, but what the engineer has to do before he or she develops it and builds it. So we have this list of 565 things, and it's pretty all-inclusive, and it's not something that every engineer or every operational commander needs to ask of themselves. They're all context dependent. So we tried to give a all-inclusive list that these folks could pick and choose from based on the context of the environment that they're using the system in.
Okay, since people might not have a very good sense of what kinds of questions we're talking about, can I just quickly cherry pick a couple that are easy to understand and give them to people? For example, there's one: can the intelligent autonomous system detect symbols that designate persons and objects protected from the use of force, such as the Red Cross or the Red Crescent? There's another one: can the system, in the event that command and control is lost, abort the mission and return to base or destroy itself? So the questions range from training to definitions to legal aspects to operational and engineering. That's a couple of examples of the kinds of questions. And are you imagining this would become a list of absolute requirements where if an item cannot be definitively answered with a yes, that's it?
None of these are requirements, actually. What they are is you ask yourself the question, and if you don't have a good answer for that, then you have to decide, do I want to accept the risk of something bad happening? Do I want to mitigate that risk by either not using the autonomous technology or using some other non-autonomous solution to get my mission done? Or do I want to invest resources in making sure that I can get a good answer to that question? If the answer to your first question is, can I recognize the presence of a Red Cross on the side of a tent or a building or a vehicle? If the answer is no, then I need to invest in a technology that will allow my autonomous system to do that.
Jason, if all of these principles are manifested through the right tools and systems and hard work, what is the end goal for you? What would be your highest hopes for the ethical implementation of autonomy?
So I have no doubt that we are going to continue to implement autonomy and automation and AI really across all of the different military applications in an ethical and responsible way. So that in and of itself is not so much a hope. It's just something I know. I know we're going to do that. So my hope really is about how we actually achieve that. And when I think about ethics and AI and autonomy, my greatest hope, my wish is that we're able to have the right conversation, and we're able to have that conversation in a fully informed way. This is what I think that looks like. First, we have to ensure that the developer community is at the table. We have to assume that as developers, we're at the table, we're both grounding the conversation with the art of the practical, but they're also broadening the conversation with the art of the possible. So that's a responsibility that's back on us as the developer community. It's a mantle we need to take up. We need to be more versed in this conversation. I think another thing that it looks like is that, again, it doesn't confuse principles with implementation details. We talked about control earlier. This is a foundational issue that we have to not make this mistake. We have to be clear on our principles so that we can then focus on how to implement. And finally, and I think actually most importantly, we have to recognize that performance of the system and ethical behavior are not zero sum. This is not a have your cake versus eat it kind of issue. You can absolutely, and we must do both. Ethical behavior absolutely can enhance the performance of a system. It can reduce collateral damage, right? It can improve our ability to do distinction. It can be used in more precise ways. All of these things literally get at our obligations under the law of war, and using systems ethically also enhances the full spectrum of performance under the AI ethical principles. And so being able to use systems ethically and improving the performance, again, it's not a zero-sum issue. We absolutely are able to achieve both simultaneously. And I think that is the mental model, that is the framework in which we need to be having that conversation.
That sounds like a superb goal. And Mike, as you approached your work, you were looking at people who have a broad range of concerns, and this included looking at the concerns raised by Beijing or the concerns raised by organizations that are completely opposed to any military use of autonomy. I'm wondering, what was your goal in casting that net so wide?
Our main goal was we have all these people who are opposed to the use of this technology in warfare applications. So we wanted to identify what are their concerns and could we address them? It turns out that not only can we address them, we share them. We surveyed documents from multiple departments of the US federal government, from many countries, from lots of civil society groups who are adamantly opposed to the use of autonomy in warfare systems. And we came up with a list of 4,681 concerns or risks from all of those documents. And when we went through and deduplicated the duplicates, that went from 4,680 to 460. It dropped by an order of magnitude. What did that tell us? And this was kind of a very shocking and interesting finding to us, is that everybody's worried about the same thing. Everybody cares about the same thing. All of our concerns are in common. What we don't want to see happen are the same things that Human Rights Watch doesn't want to see happen. Multiple different countries with many different governing styles and definitions of civil rights and human rights, for example. So the commonality that came out of our analysis was fascinating and quite interesting. We all care about the same thing. Some of us have different opinions on how to execute that.
That's a very interesting observation and even quantified. Jason, Navy approval was required in order to release this report to the public. So even though it was independently produced by CNA, I'd like to know why the Navy would want to make public a document that's about the decisions of what autonomous systems to develop and deploy.
It's a great question. And to be frank, this is a conversation that it really has to be done publicly. So to explain that, let me first just kind of remind us, like, what exactly are we talking about, right? What is this conversation about? It's fundamentally about two things. What is our overarching intent for this space of AI autonomy and ethics? And again, in plain English, it is really to maximize the effectiveness of the various systems that the DoD has while ensuring the appropriate levels of human judgment, our ability to support law of war, our ability to comply with AI ethical principles. That's the overarching intent. And then second, we're talking about, okay, now how do I go implement systems to do that? So in that context, the question on why talk about this publicly, there's two answers, because there's fundamentally two audiences that we're actually talking to. So let me distinguish both. One is a specific conversation with the developer community. When we're talking to the developer community, we need to specifically be talking about how we design and build our machines and our human-machine interfaces to achieve the two goals that we just talked about. And again, the developer community, because it is government, industry, academia, both domestic and international, by definition, that is a public conversation. Furthermore, technology is evolving so rapidly, it's evolving so fast that there's no other way to have this conversation. We would be outpaced, right? If you tried to control it, you would be outpaced by it. So you have to be transparent, and we have to engage in a full and open way. The second audience is really society writ large, and it includes all of our stakeholders, including our policymakers. And the reason that this has to be open and transparent is when we start talking about these implementation details, it is complex. What's clear is, again, our guideposts, where we're going. But how we implement is complex. I've used the automotive industry as a couple of examples. If you think back from mass production in 1908 up until today, if you think about some parts of that conversation resonated more than other parts. Those of us that were driving cars in the 1980s, there was a lot of evolution on brake light specifications. I don't think anyone noticed or cared other than an engineer. But remember back to seatbelt laws when those were introduced, right? You remember the entire nation going ballistic around seatbelt laws. And so that was a healthy and vigorous conversation, but it has to be done in a transparent way. And so that's what we really need here. And again, that's why we're grateful to CNA and the great work on this study. Like Mike said, it's a first step, but it's a heck of a step to really have that transparent foundation on the conversation of how we support the broader community in implementing our AI and autonomous systems in an ethical way.
Well, I'd like to think that we've contributed to that healthy and vigorous discussion today. So, Dr. Jason Stack, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today.
Hey, thanks again, Don. I appreciate you, Mike, and the whole CNA team and everything that you guys have done. This is an absolute great step in moving us along, and look forward to the continued discussion.
And Dr. Mike Stumborg, it was also great having you on CNA Talks, and not for the last time, I hope.
I hope not. There's much to be discussed.
And see you next time on CNA Talks.
Thanks for listening to CNA Talks. The views expressed are those of the commentators and do not necessarily reflect those of CNA or any of its sponsors. CNA Talks is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimson. Our theme music is by Edward Grenga. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.